Welcome back to the Cybersecurity Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to be talking a lot about cybersecurity resilience and redundancy. Now, as we're building all of our cybersecurity strategies, we wouldn't want things just to break, so we need to find ways to make a robust system. So, what is resilience in resilience in redundancy in cybersecurity? Well, this ensures that the organization can withstand and quickly recover from disruptions, whether caused by cyber attacks, hardware failures, remember we can still have those, or even natural disasters. So, what's the difference here? Well, resilience is the ability to operate and bounce back in the face of challenges, while redundancy may be full backup systems that can take over if one fails. Now, we're going to talk a lot about different techniques, and these are going to be a lot of terminologies that you should know for the Security Plus, so keep in touch with your flashcards. So HA, otherwise known as high availability, this is where we're going to design and implement systems in our network to ensure that we have continuous operation with minimal downtime. So if we have hardware failures like hard drive failures or server failures or anything like that, or other disruptions, how do we recover from them? Now, this is normally measured in uptime, typically measured as a percentage. Like if you hear, hey, I've got a 4.9 system, am I on 99.99% uptime? And what does that look like um, in reporting? Now, there are some key strategies when we're dealing with high availability. One of them is going to be the redundancy model. We need to make sure that we have redundant systems like backup servers, databases, or network components that are in place to automatically take over if a system fails. This ensures that there is no single point of failure. Our failure mechanisms look like maybe a backup or a secondary component, like maybe more than one power supply in a server, or multiple hard drives within a server, or in a networking switch stack, maybe there's multiple networking switches that can take over to make sure that we have continued operation without manual intervention. We can go look at load balancers to make sure that incoming traffic is pushed across multiple servers, ensuring that no single server is overwhelmed. We can look at clustering so that we can make sure that multiple systems can work as a single unit to ensure that our users look at everything as a single device. And even if a cluster fails, other nodes within the cluster can take over without interrupting service. Lastly, HA has a geographic redundancy piece. Do we have multiple locations with our data centers to have, just in case a local disaster like a power outage or a tornado takes out our data center, can we still operate from a different location? Data redundancy, on the other hand, is talking a little bit more about the data itself. We're referring to where we can have multiple copies of the same data in multiple locations or systems to protect against data loss, corruption, or even system failures. By having redundant copies of data, we can recover from incidences so much faster that would otherwise lead maybe to a loss of data. Now, there's multiple ways of looking at data redundancy here. We can look at on-site data redundancy, where organizations will have multiple copies on different storage devices. Or we can look at off-site data redundancy, where we may have site-wide disaster, for instance, so that way we have copies of our data at remote locations or even in the cloud as of today. Off-site redundancy is definitely going to be needed for disaster recovery strategies. We may be using RAID, in other words, a redundant array of independent disks on our servers, and this helps protect against data loss from disk failure itself. And there's different types of RAIDs we can talk about. We can talk about our backup solutions. So backups, regular backups, whether or not they're on-site, off-site, whatever they may be, we need to make sure that they have snapshots of the data that could be restored in case of accidental deletion, corruption, or even ransomware. Now let's talk a little bit more about RAID. So RAID technology itself, if you've taken the A+, you should know about RAID. But I like to do a review when it comes to cybersecurity because our data is important to us. RAID 0 is for striping, fast, no backups. This is something all about performance, does not do anything for HA or fault tolerance. We've got RAID 1, where all our data is mirrored between one or more drives, or two or more drives, I'm sorry. This is for backups, that's a one-to-one backup normally. We've got a RAID 5, where we have striping with parity. This is 3 or more disks. RAID 5 only has one layer of parity, so we're allowed to lose one disk without failing the RAID. We have RAID 6, which will have striping with double parity, a lot like RAID 5, but instead we've got 2 layers of parity. In other words, we could lose 2 disks within this RAID array and still survive. And then last, we've got the golden ticket, which is RAID 10 or 0+1, depending on who you speak to, which is where we take striping and mirroring, we put it together, and we've got a very redundant RAID system, and as well has the performance that a RAID 0 gives us. Now, you can lose almost half the drives if you lose the proper drives within RAID 10, because we have so many redundant disks sitting here. Now, there are a couple of different types of RAID. Remember, you're going to see different things like hardware RAID versus software RAID. Hardware RAIDs require an actual hardware device to maintain that RAID configuration, while a software RAID is built on top of software to ensure that it can be done a little bit more flexible, but is a little normally slower because of additional overhead. So when you're configuring a RAID, there are going to be a couple different steps you need to think about. You need to determine the RAID level. What level of storage capacity, redundancy, and performance do you need? Then you need to select the drives, because some RAID will require a certain level of drives, especially for the amount of storage that you may need. You need to configure your RAID controller, whether or not it's software or hardware. We need to initialize the RAID, and then we can format it and mount the array to our devices to make sure that they're usable. Okay. Now, when we're dealing with this, we're going to have to really think about capacity planning. We need to determine the amount of resources needed for future demands within our organization. And so when we're thinking about capacity planning, some of the things we need to look about will be storage capacity, which could be, well, how much space do we need? And don't just think about today, but think about in the future growth of the system. Network bandwidth, as network traffic increases, do we need to plan for additional network load, for like maybe internal traffic, cloud services, remote access, whatever it may be? And just know that even just doing backups of our system is going to take up bandwidth. Then we're going to need to think about processing power. Processing power is our CPU and memory. Do we have enough to effectively handle all of our loads efficiently? Because inadequate CPU and memory can lead for slow response times, system crashes and failures, which is going to bring down our availability of our cybersecurity platform. Then we'll need to talk about our data backups and redundancy. Just because we have redundant systems doesn't mean we don't need to take backups. Data backups will need to be stored in multiple locations, offsite or in the cloud, for disaster recovery purposes. We need to make sure that we're scaling for growth. Just because we buy new servers, they do take time to procure, so we need to make sure that we're overbuilding our systems to handle future growth of our systems. And then lastly, we need to think about our security resources, like firewalls or intrusion detection systems or monitoring tools. Are they also scalable when we're building our systems? Because as we keep growing our systems, that's only going to put heavier and heavier load on our security resources. And if we hit a max capacity there, it would probably take time for us to figure out how do we recover from these additional growth. So what are the steps in dealing with capacity planning? Well, first we need to assess our current resources. We need to look at the current usage of our systems, whether or not that's CPU, memory, or storage. This will help us start to predict the future requirements, because we need to know where we are today before we can forecast for future requirements. Then we can plan for redundancy and scalability. Even during failures, how do we remain operational? And then lastly, we need to monitor and adjust. So this is an ongoing process to ensure that we avoid any bottlenecks or any procurement wait times as we're waiting for additional hardware. So this could be adding storage, upgrading servers, or increasing network bandwidth. Okay. Now, we have to power our data centers because power is one of the most critical aspects when it comes to IT. And we need to make sure that the data centers can uphold everything that we deal with, including with power failures. So there are key components when we're dealing with power. You need to know that we will have, of course, a primary power supply. A lot of times these will have redundant power supplies, so that way in case the power grid does get interrupted, we have more than one grid available to us. Most data centers have at least 3 grids available to them. That way, if one grid goes down, the other 2 can pick up the slack. We'll have UPSs built into our systems. These are just large battery backups to ensure that we have constant power to our servers. Not only are they going to provide constant power, they're going to provide clean power. So there's things where we could have power spikes or power dips, such as brownouts, and UPSs will even out that power distribution for our servers, so that way we will not be affected by them. We'll use backup generators to provide long-term power during extended outages, and these generators need to kick in for an extended period of time, and they typically run on diesel. There are some that run on natural gas, but backup generators are needed because the UPSs are only for short-term fixes. We need to make sure that we are power redundant, and these are the couple different power redundant models that we have. Like N+1 means I have a primary loop plus an extra backup power supply. So this way, if at one works, I have a secondary component or a secondary system that will work. You can have 2N, where you have 2 completely separate systems within here. Think of this like 2 completely separate power grids. And then maybe you have a 2N+1, where you have 2 fully independent power grids, but you might have an additional gear to also help when downtime is just not available to us. And as I said, most environments actually nowadays have 3N power redundancy for this reason. Then we got to think about how are we going to distribute this power, and this is where we're going to find PDUs, power distribution units. And these power distribution units usually are intelligent PDUs to help us monitor for power utilization, turn on and off devices, and have proper cooling. So when we get into the cooling aspect, otherwise known as HVAC in most cases, we need to be able to power our systems, which is going to make things hot. Well, how are we going to cool it? Could be air conditioning, could be liquid cooling systems, or it could just be natural cooling from outside, depending on the location that you live. And then finally, we need to make sure that the energy efficiency is up and sustainable, because we use a lot of energy. How do we bring down our operational costs? So you'll start seeing a lot of data centers bring in things like energy efficient hardware, or they'll bring in solar or wind or hydroelectric power. This way, we're trying to bring down our reliance on fossil fuels, because we still do need to make sure that we're looking out for the environment as we move down this road and ensure that it is going to be a sustainable model. Because if we just keep using more and more power, then that's going to bring a larger impact to the environment and our operational costs. Now, let's talk about backups. So backups are also another thing that's going to be tested on the SecurityPlus, and they do want you to know the different types of backups as well. So we're going to store the backup separately from the original source, just in case we need to be able to recover. And this could be from many different types of threats. And remember, these vulnerabilities and threats are out there. They could be hardware failures, cyber attacks, accidental deletions, or even natural disasters. Now, let's talk about the different types of backups. We've got the full backup, which is the complete copy of the system. This is the highest level of protection, but also takes up the most space and time to create. We have an incremental backup. This was changes to any data since the last backup. Doesn't matter if it was a full or an incremental. This is if I don't have a backup of any file that's been changed since the last backup, we're going to back it up. We've got a differential backup. These are the last backup since the last full. So even if the file changes day over day, a differential backup will be all the files that have changed since the last full backup. Now these are very useful because if I need to recover a system, I can recover the full backup and then the last differential backup. And then if I have an incremental backup after that, I can just put those in there. But for instance, if I had 5 days of incrementals, I would have to install the 5 incrementals after my full backup, which creates 6 files I'll have to restore to get the data back, which takes time. You can do a mirror backup, which is going to be an exact copy of the source data. This is very quick for recovery, but takes the most amount of capital and storage requirements. And then finally, something we've been doing more and more, we need an offsite backup, so why not use the cloud? We can use cloud backups to help us have high scalability and geographic redundancy with our backups. There are some best practices when it comes to backups, and there is the 3-2-1 rule. When we're talking about the 3-2-1 rule, we're going to keep 3 copies of all data, 1 original and 2 backups. We're going to then store 2 copies on different media, like maybe we'll put 1 in the cloud and then 1 in another external hard drive. And then 1 of the copies should always be kept off-site. Because the 2 copies, 1 of them maybe in the cloud, this follows this rule to make sure that 1 copy is off-site to protect against natural disasters. We need to make sure that our backups are fully automated. We do not want to have to risk human error here, so we're going to use backup automation tools to schedule regular backups and ensure that the critical data is included. We need to make sure that we're testing our backups because you don't want to be that person who looks for their backups and the backups are corrupted. So testing allows us to make sure that we know, well, how long is it going to recover by, and identify any issues during the recovery process. We should encrypt our backups. Encryption of our backups helps us ensure that if the backup media was ever stolen, that it will not be compromised, that the data will remain safe, secure, and unreadable without the encryption key. This also helps protect against things like ransomware, because ransomware won't be able to read the information to encrypt it. Now, we will also look at implement retention policies to make sure that we're not just keeping all data forever. We do need to make sure that we are deleting data when it's no longer needed. Now, what are the benefits? Well, disaster recovery is the number 1 benefit. It helps us also protect against ransomware, and it will help us stay in compliance and legal requirements, because remember, those fines and penalties for regulations are very hefty. We do not want to fall prone to those, so compliance and legal requirements are very important for us. And then, of course, having regular backups helps us recover quickly from unexpected instances, so our business continuity is assured. So let's talk about COOP a little bit, which is continuity of operations procedures. And this is the policies and procedures to make sure that we continue operating even if a natural disaster, system failure, or cyber attack happens. Now, there are going to be things that we need to think about. And we're going to think about redundant sites a little bit here. Because what if a tornado does take out your data center? How are you going to continue operating? So for the SecurityPlus, you should know that there's going to be a risk assessment and business impact analysis completed, otherwise known as a BIA, to understand everything that is entailed with moving systems and the acceptable levels of downtimes and data for each. We're going to have a disaster recovery plan, which is going to help us focus on recovering our systems after an incident. And this is going to show us exactly how we're going to do it and how we bring technical systems back online as quickly as possible. We need to make sure we got our data backups intact, because how are we going to recover without our backups? We need to make sure our redundant systems and high availability strategies are still there to make sure that we have minimal downtime. We're going to need to make sure our site and infrastructure considerations were properly utilized, such as having UPSs or robust physical security within the site to ensure that operations will continue to exist even if we are being attacked again or we have additional power failures. And then we should test these things. If we don't test them and have drills, there's no way for us to know how well we are planning for. Which brings us down to the final which is Business Continuity Management, BCM, to help us continuously monitor for threats and update the plan. So, business continuity management is about going through all of this on a regular basis and updating our procedures and policies to ensure that we are going to keep improving upon our continuity operational procedures and management. So, our continuity of operational plan, our COOP. So, we do want to minimize downtime, mitigate financial loss, make sure we're staying in compliance, right? And then we're just definitely just building in resilience. So that's the whole reason about COOP. We want to make sure business impact analyses are done, so our business continuity management platform will just keep improving upon it so we can recover from any incidents that happen within our network. Now, let's talk a little bit about redundant site considerations. So we have a couple of different redundant sites that we can choose from, and one of them is all about, well, how do we recover if a disruption or a natural disaster took out our primary site? So we have 3 sites to think about. We've got our height site, which is having a full facility that mirrors the primary site in real time, or at least in near real time, so we could fail over to it quickly if needed. We have a warm site where it may have all the hardware and everything there, but software and data replication might need some work before we get up and running. Or finally, we may have a cold site where it has a space and power, but almost nothing pre-installed. The cold site is, of course, going to be the cheapest, while the hot site is going to be the most expensive. But it all depends on your organization and what you can deal with a recovery time. Well, how do you choose your redundant site? Well, for one, we're going to be thinking about redundant locations. We need to make sure the geographical location isn't just our next door neighbor, because if that tornado took our data center out, could it take them out as well? So we want to make sure that the location is further away, but close enough that we could still recover in a timely manner. We need to make sure there's good network connectivity and bandwidth there. We need to make sure that it follows our recovery time objective and our recovery point objective times. So our TO is the maximum settable time to restore operations, while our PO is the maximum amount of data loss that we can have. So if we can't follow these recovery times, then why are we trying to recover at all? Let's talk about security requirements. Do they have proper security requirements? Do they have the data that we need? Do we have data replication or synchronization there? Have we tested this site? Hopefully we have. And what are the costs of this site? Sometimes they can be very expensive. Remember, hot sites are going to be very expensive to maintain, and if you never end up using it, is it going to then be too high of a cost to the point where it may get cut in the budget? And then lastly, we still need to make sure that we're in compliance with regulations. Even though our data center was taken out, we need to make sure that we're compliant because we don't want any of those heavy fees. So let's talk more about resilience and recovery testing. And this is all about ensuring that we can recover. Are we going to have the minimal downtime, and can we recover? So when we're dealing with this testing, we need to identify any of those gaps in our continuity planning. So our BIA and the BCM, remember, we need to just keep recovering on those and keep improving upon them. So are there any gaps in our plan? How do we minimize downtime? Could we improve upon our processes to ensure that we have the least amount of operational disruptions? Can we then ensure data integrity and availability of our data? And are we meeting compliance? Now, there's a lot of different types of testing that we can do with this to improve upon, such as let's do a failover test. Maybe we could do a backup and restore drill where we take whether or not the backups themselves can be recovered from loss. We might do a disaster recovery drill where we might simulate a real-world example or a disaster and try to see if we can recover from it. We might do an incident response simulation like, hey, we've got a denial of service attack. How do we recover from it? Then we need to make sure that, again, how quickly can the systems be restored from a certain point, so our RTO, and how much data would be lost if we did this with an RPO, and are they still within acceptable levels of measure? Finally, we have our best practices. We need to do this on a regular basis. We need to involve everybody around us who understand the roles in case of an emergency. So we like to simulate these things in a realistic environment, like a tabletop scenario, and we want to mimic real world conditions. So a lot of times we'll do this without telling anybody and throw it on them and see how well we can recover. We do need to be able to test across multiple environments. So we need to make sure it's on-prem, cloud, hybrid, whatever it may be, to make sure that we are able to recover properly. And then finally, we need to review and update our plans, because we're going to find problems in it, and we're going to find gaps in how, and maybe even improve upon it. So we're going to fix these. Now remember, resilience and recovery testing is going to be very important. You do need to know these key topics when you're dealing with the SecurityPlus. So please review the flashcards and practice if you need to, and we can keep talking on. If we're going to do this in class, here's where we're going to start doing our Kahoot. And if you are online, well, please try to join us if you can. I'll see you next time for the next video. Continue studying. We'll all be SecurityPlus certified in no time.